so much for that warm welcome, and happy Constitution Day, everybody. Thank you. I'm delighted to be making a return visit to the Lou Frey Institute, and I'd like to thank Congressman Frey, Drew, Lanier, and all of your colleagues for your impressive work to actually implement the remarkable Constitution that we're celebrating today. Now, of course, the Constitution reflects inspiring ideals of a government that is designed to promote liberty and justice for all. You've all heard those words many times, but the Constitution is not self-enforcing. James Madison, who was one of its principal architects, said that the Constitution is a mere parchment barrier between we, the people, who adopted it, and official abuses. In other words, it's only worth the paper that it's written on unless all of us are aware of our rights and stand up for them, demanding that our elected officials actually honor those rights. So I really hope that everyone here, especially the students, will celebrate the Constitution not just by passively listening to us talking heads or revering the Constitution as some antique historic document that you see behind glass at the National Archives, but rather what it is, what it was designed to do, and how it deserves to be respected. And that is, it is a blueprint for action by each and every single one of you. It charters you to fight for as much freedom as you want. I have to tell you that I didn't realize, and I was comparing notes with Jonathan Turley up here, we didn't realize what a high percentage of our audience would be high school students. And I'm really glad about that because I wrote remarks for a university audience, and I think that's what you deserve to hear, right? But I'm going to add footnotes or parentheticals as I'm doing right now, that this is at least as much geared toward the very youngest members of our civic society, because the habits and attitudes and patterns that you start developing now are going to stand you through your lifetime. And I can tell you, speaking as the former head of the nation's largest and oldest civil liberties organizations, that we have worked so closely with even much younger students in middle school and in elementary school, who recognize that or have questions when somebody is abusing their rights. And now the teachers are going to say, never invite her again, because I'm going to say we have a lot of cases where teachers and principals are violating rights of students. And I would be, and we've worked very successfully to stand up and fight those abuses, whether it be privacy, whether it be free speech, whether it be fundamental fairness. So I hope that during the question and answer period, you'll feel free to ask me questions about what your rights are specifically in the school context. But the subject I'm going to talk about is a much broader one that affects everybody in this country, including those of us who are school students. Before I say any more on that topic, I want to tell you a favorite story of mine as a New Yorker who is happily here in Florida. This is a story about our two states. It involves 4 women who are driving across the United States, one each from Florida, New York, Idaho, and Nebraska. And soon after the trip begins, the woman from Idaho starts pulling potatoes out of her bag and throwing them out the car window. And others say, well, why in the world are you doing that? And she says, we have so many of these darn things in Idaho, I'm just sick of looking at them. So a minute later, the woman from Nebraska starts pulling ears of corn from her bag and tossing them out the window. And they ask her why she's doing that. She says, we have so many of these darn things in Nebraska, I'm just sick of looking at them. Well, inspired by those 2 other passengers, the Florida woman opens the car door and tosses out the New Yorker. Thank you for, I'm going back to New York tonight. Well, today's theme for Constitution Day was when the Constitution confronts the 21st century, and that's again where all of you are leaders through the 21st century. One issue that has been predominant so far through these first years of the 21st century, and I fear it's going to continue to be, is the ongoing devastating impact of the so-called war on terror on the constitutional freedoms of every single one of us. And I believe for those of you who are as young now as I was when the civil rights movement was going on in this country for racial justice, that this is a counterpart to that. It is the biggest struggle, the most ongoing, with the most pervasive power to potentially transform, either positively or negatively, the actual state of constitutional freedoms. And unfortunately, we're not doing so well, so we're really going to depend on all of you to raise your voices and stand up for freedom against the siege it's been undergoing since the terrorist attacks. And I have to tell you, both of the institutions to which I have devoted my professional life, the ACLU and New York Law School, both are just blocks away from ground zero. So, and literally like 4 and 5 blocks away, respectively. So on September 11th, 2001, I was at least as shocked and furious and galvanized to combat al-Qaeda terrorists as anyone else. I will never forget President Bush's first words to our stricken nation on the night of those attacks. They literally, well, not literally, but I feel as if they're literally emblazoned in my brain, because you know how certain traumatic events occur and you remember exactly where you were and exactly who said what. And I will never forget that President George W. Bush said that the terrorists attacked us because we are the greatest beacon for liberty and opportunity the world has ever known. And then he vowed, no one will keep that light from shining. You know, one of the reasons I moved to New York is I love the Statue of Liberty, and that image of the Statue of Liberty and her beacon for freedom and opportunity, and the pledge not to let the terrorists put out that light. It was so moving and inspiring to me, and I have to tell you, ever since then, the ACLU has been working tirelessly to help our government keep that vow. And I think, unfortunately, that preeminent vow has not been at the forefront of either of the post-9/11 administrations, the Bush administration and now the Obama administration. And this is my first opportunity to introduce a very important theme that might be, I know it's going to be very surprising to many of you, because we live in this hyper-partisan political atmosphere. One of the things that's kind of interesting to me living in New York, which is not considered to be in contention in the presidential election, so they don't really bother to have too many campaign ads. So here, I know you're probably sick of them, but for me it was really, really interesting to see the constant ads on television for the presidential campaign. And we know that there are so many problems with our government being able to be effective because of partisan gridlock. I was speaking to Congressman Frey about that. This was not a problem in his day, and he exemplified working neutrally on issues of common concern to all of us as Americans, and in this case to all of us who are committed to preserving constitutional values. So the ACLU, one of our cardinal organizational principles is that we are strictly nonpartisan. We never take a position for or against anybody who's running for office or campaigning to be appointed for office. Rather, we issue praise or criticism on an issue-by-issue basis, because support for civil liberties cuts completely across the political spectrum, and sadly, opposition also does. You'll hear plenty more on that theme, but I urge all of you to really focus on the issues and the principles rather than who is the person or who is the party. Get behind that rhetoric and of course, affiliate yourself if that's your interest with whatever party more accords with your values, but please do not use that as a pathway to advocating and working on issues that you care about, rather than something that just brings about gridlock. But, when we get back to what was our initial response, that the terrorists attacked us because of our values of liberty and equality, and we're going to prevent anyone from destroying those values. It would be absolutely tragic then if we did the terrorist work for them. And a lot of people don't think this through. Perhaps all of you have, but the word terrorism comes from, of course, terror or fear, and the whole methodology of terrorism is to make people so afraid that they will change their own institutions. And so you see, the terrorists would have won. We would have done their work for them if we allowed ourselves to be so terrorized, so frightened, that we ourselves voluntarily abandoned the traditional American values of liberty and justice for all, which is why al-Qaeda attacked us, as President George W. Bush said. I'm going to quote on that point an extremely respected man, happens to be a Republican, General Colin Powell, who was so respected as a military leader that he achieved the highest position in the military, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so respected as a foreign policy expert that he achieved the highest foreign policy position, Secretary of State under President George W. Bush. A couple of years ago, a journalist on TV asked Powell, what is the greatest threat that our country faces? And here's what he answered. He said, people will say it's terrorism, but are there any terrorists in the world who can change the American way of life or our political system? No. Can they knock down a building? Yes. Can they kill somebody? Yes. But can they change us? No. Only we can change ourselves. So what is the greatest threat we are facing? And obviously the unanswered, unstated, was stated expressly by a famous cartoon by Walt Kelly, Pogo. We have met the enemy, and he is us. Now, right after the 9/11 attacks, the ACLU launched what we called our Safe and Free campaign. Based on history, we knew the typical reaction to any national security threat is to scapegoat civil liberties, to unjustifiably assume that we would be safer if we cut back on our freedom. However, history also shows that sacrificing freedom for the purported sake of safety is too often ineffective at best, counterproductive at worst. Prime post-9/11 examples include such illegal and discredited techniques as torture and secret black hole prisons. Leading intelligence and military officials have said that such abusive methods that profoundly violate human rights actually are also undermining our national security in the so-called war on terror. And that's because we are losing the moral high ground and moral authority, which is really essential in a war that is fundamentally a war of ideas. And I'm going to cite two military experts. Again, they're making a point that is also supported by human rights and civil liberties advocates, but they're saying, hey, this makes sense from a purely national security perspective as well. So the two I'm quoting are Charles Krulak of the Marine Corps and Joseph Hoare of the U.S. Central Command. They recently wrote, this war on terror will be won or lost not on the battlefield, but in the minds of potential supporters who have not yet thrown in their lot with the enemy. If we forfeit our values by signaling that they are negotiable in situations of grave or imminent danger, we drive the undecideds into the arms of the enemy. This way lies defeat and we are well down the road to it. Now, as indicated by the military leaders I've already quoted, the ACLU's Safe and Free campaign has been supported by a broad, diverse range of government officials and citizens groups from completely across the political spectrum. Again, I want to emphasize, it doesn't matter whether you think of yourself as liberal, conservative, Republican, or Democrat. These should be values that you, as devotees of the Constitution, would support. So many members of Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, have deplored the many executive actions that have violated the famous checks and balances in the Constitution that I know you've all heard about, so no one branch of government should have too much power. And they also have deplored many executive abuses of individual rights. We've also seen strong bipartisan critiques of overreaching congressional measures. Many of you have probably heard of the USA Patriot Act, which gave the government sweeping new powers to limit the freedom and privacy of every single one of us. And I mean that literally, whether you know it or not, and whether you have an absolutely lily pure record where you've never even been suspected of anything illegal at all, you still have less freedom and less privacy as a result of the USA Patriot Act. This was passed in a rush, literally only 45 days after the terrorist attacks. Can you imagine? You know, it's hundreds of pages long with hundreds of provisions, cross-references to many other pieces of legislation. There was almost no hearing, almost no debate. But you know, a lot of people voted for it, quite frankly, because of that name. USA Patriot Act. Can you imagine an era of soundbite politics? My opponent voted against the Patriot Act. And that's exactly why it was named that way. But when you get beneath the labels and see what it actually does, it really is unpatriotic in terms of undermining basic freedoms that all of us deserve. One of the strongest critics of the Patriot Act was actually a member of the House Republican leadership at the time, just as Congressman Frey was a member of the I'm trying to look to where he was, but Congressman Frey was also a member of the House Republican leadership during the 93rd and 94th Congress. The one I'm quoting was from Alaska, Congressman Don Young. And here's what he said about the Patriot Act. He said, everybody voted for it, but it was stupid. It was emotional voting. We didn't study it. It's the worst piece of legislation we've ever passed. There are probably a lot of contenders for that award when you think about it, so those are obviously extremely strong words. The ACLU's Safe and Free allies have also included major conservative citizens groups, everything from the American Conservative Union to gun owners' rights groups. I know many of you are familiar with the very large and powerful National Rifle Association, the NRA. They and other gun owners' rights groups fiercely oppose this legislation because too often their members are targeted for government surveillance and harassment and worse, merely because they are exercising what is, after all, a constitutional and statutorily protected right of gun ownership. And I'd like to quote one of the leaders of the NRA, Wayne LaPierre, because he's speaking to his members, many of whom supported then President George W. Bush, specifically on Second Amendment gun owners' rights issues. But LaPierre is making the same point I was making earlier. Please get beyond your narrow partisan concerns. And he said, maybe you think that with President George W. Bush in the White House, everything is safe. You think you can put aside your principles just this once to be a loyal conservative. But if we as conservatives don't stand up for these fundamental truths, who will? Never accept the idea that surrendering freedom, any freedom, is the price of feeling safe. Likewise, our Safe and Free campaign has also had a lot of support from the so-called religious right, conservative Christians who were very enthusiastic, in particular, about the first Attorney General in the George W. Bush administration, a gentleman named John Ashcroft, who was Attorney General at the time that the Patriot Act was passed, and so forth. And conservative Christians supported Ashcroft because he agreed with their views on abortion and gay rights, namely opposing those. But they still decried the new investigative guidelines that Ashcroft issued after 9/11, which allows suspicionless surveillance and infiltration of religious and political groups. So we have government agents policing and eavesdropping on religious and political gatherings. And hi to all of you government agents out there. I always welcome you and love the fact that you're listening to this, but some of my colleagues might not like it, particularly at some of their religious gatherings. So here's what the head of the Family Research Council, a Christian organization, said. He said, "We religious conservatives need to ask ourselves, how would our groups fare under these new rules?" And, you know, speaking about rules, you've all heard of the golden rule. I'm told, I'm not a scholar of world religions, but I'm told it's a pervasive concept that knits together many different religious faiths. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. When you think about it, that's a pretty good way of summing up civil liberties and constitutional rights. If we want to enjoy those rights ourselves, no matter who we are, no matter what we believe, no matter what demographic pigeonholes society might want to put us into in terms of politics, religion, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, you name it, we are human beings. And for that reason, we have fundamental rights under our Constitution. And therefore, if we want to enjoy our own rights, we have to stand up for and defend the rights of everyone else. And so I'm giving you these examples of people who've broken beyond usual partisan divides or issue divides to defend fundamental freedoms post 9/11. Now I'm going to mention just one other example of these diverse allies because they represent a community and issues that are so important now, and that is the business community, right? And who are concerned about economic well-being and hopefully prosperity. One of the other major challenges that obviously is facing us now and all of you into the future. And therefore, I was absolutely ecstatic that for the first time ever in any civil liberties campaign that the ACLU has ever worked on, we were joined by a coalition of the leading business organizations in this country opposing the overreaching of the USA Patriot Act. I know you've heard of some of these groups, at least the United States Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, the National Association of Realtors, among others. And they were saying these policies of government overreaching are as bad for our economy and for business as they are for individual rights and national security. And I'm going to quote to you part of the letter that they sent to Congress saying, repeal this overreaching power of government to command business to turn over what should be confidential records about our customers. They said confidential business files, records about our customers and our employees, as well as our trade secrets and other proprietary information, can too easily be obtained under the Patriot Act. Reforming the Patriot Act is essential to ensure that powerful law enforcement tools are focused on those who would do us harm, and that privacy rights and business interests are protected. So the Bush administration was dead wrong when it dismissed the criticism of its post-9/11 excesses as mere partisan attacks. And certainly the ACLU and other human rights organizations have kept up our criticism of the Obama administration, which in some ways has gone even further than the Bush administration did. And A couple of the other speakers and I were comparing notes about this as we were coming over here from our hotel. Again, because of the hyper-partisanship of political debate, too many liberals who were happy to stridently denounce President George W. Bush for post-9/11 policies, including suspicionless detention in Guantanamo of people who were suspected terrorists. Well, that's a terrible thing, to be kept there, perhaps for your entire life, sadly, in many cases for your entire life. Just a couple of days ago, somebody who had been there from the beginning died, even though he was somebody who, under both the Bush and Obama administrations, had been pronounced not a serious threat ever, that he was perhaps picked up by mistake in the first place, but if he had ever been a threat, that he certainly wasn't anymore. And yet he was still in Guantanamo, and he died. There had been several suicide attempts and hunger strikes, which no doubt weakened him. So that kind of lifelong detention is certainly something that did deserve strident criticism. But how many of you know that the Obama administration has gone one further, without any due process at all, without any judicial review? This administration decides that if it believes somebody is a suspected terrorist, they can kill that person, even if that person is not on a battlefield, even if that person is an American citizen. And several American citizens have been killed in that fashion. And too many liberals who said, well, criticized the Bush administration for unilaterally detaining and imprisoning suspected terrorists without due process, have not criticized the Obama administration for unilaterally killing somebody who is a suspected terrorist. So again, the criticism has to be even, just as the praise has to be even. And this kind of criticism is not taken lightly. Both the Obama administration and the Bush administration don't like criticism. I think the strongest retort came from former Attorney General John Ashcroft, who actually said that those of us who were criticizing civil liberties violations were unpatriotic, and I say us because he made that statement to the Senate Judiciary Committee right after I had testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee. So I took that as some kind of praise, that I was doing what I consider my patriotic duty. That reminds me of a headline in one of my favorite publications, which is called The Onion. I assume some of you have read that. This headline read, "Bush asks Congress for $30 billion to help fight war on criticism." And in the same vein, another headline read, "Revised Patriot Act will make it illegal to read original Patriot Act." Well, as I said, many members of Congress wouldn't have to worry because they admitted that they didn't read the original Patriot Act before voting for it. Now, I unfortunately don't see a clock here, so I'm going to ask Drew how much time do I have, because I want to leave time for questions. 5 minutes? 5 minutes. Okay, so in the 5 minutes, I think the most important thing that I want to do is to give you some examples of the kinds of post-9/11 measures that could well be affecting you or people you know. And not just those other people who are suspected of terrorism. Okay, every one of you might be one of the hundreds of thousands of innocent Americans that the FBI has been spying on with no notice through greatly expanded surveillance powers. Your high school, your university, your doctor, your banker, others to whom you entrust confidential, sensitive, personal data might well be asked by the government to turn over that data to a government data bank where it can be analyzed and stored indefinitely without your ever knowing it. Also, unbeknownst to you, your phone calls, your texts, your emails, your web surfing, your book borrowing records from libraries, all of this may well already be in the government's possession. That's because on hundreds of thousands of occasions, countless telecommunications workers and librarians have been conscripted by the government to turn over this sensitive customer information and then barred from telling anyone that they've done so. So they can turn over your data and you will never know. You could be the computer studies student who was prosecuted for providing material support to terrorism, faced up to 15 years in prison. Why? Because he served as a webmaster for a website that posted links to other people's hateful comments. You could be the college student, ACLU representative, who was taking a course in Arabic. He was detained at an airport and interrogated for 5 hours for packing his Arabic English flashcards to study during a flight. Oh, speaking of flying, you could find yourself unable to make an important trip because your name was erroneously placed on a no-fly list. A government study, a study by the government itself, found that fully 35% of the names on these bloated lists were there in error. And a federal judge recently stated in ruling favorably on an ACLU challenge to these lists, the astounding fact that the government's own witness could not explain. If your name is on one of these lists in error, how can you get your name off it? The government itself couldn't explain that. Now, with this current reality, I'm going to add a dose of history. I'm sure you've all studied past situations in American history where national security was threatened and where, with 2020 hindsight, we know that we overreacted by scapegoating freedom in ways that were not only devastating to human rights, but did absolutely nothing to make us safer as a country. The most heinous example is the internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II, which has now been admitted to have been a national scandal and disgrace, such that President Ronald Reagan, a revered conservative Republican, in 1988 apologized and paid reparations to the surviving Japanese Americans who had been in concentration camps. 50 years had passed. It was too late for many of them. And what I'm urging all of you to do is let's learn from those past mistakes, and let's not, we've already waited 11 years, let's not wait 50 years. I can sum up all the my points about the unjustified, unconstitutional post-9/11 measures by quoting a couple satiric definitions from the Nation magazine Dictionary of Current Political Terminology. So here are its two definitions of Patriot Act. 1, the preemptive strike on American freedoms to prevent the terrorists from destroying them first. Number 2, the elimination of one of the reasons why they hate us. So these are very sobering. In the same vein, here's how the Nation's dictionary defines 9/11. Tragedy used to justify any government policy. Well, we're not going to leave it that way, right? As an activist, I'm congenitally an optimist, so I'm going to end on a positive note. Here I'd like to quote a filmmaker, Woody Allen. Some of you may have seen some of his films. He was coming to the end of one of his talks, and he said, I really want to end with a positive, but I can't think of anything positive to say. Would you settle for 2 negatives? So all of you math students should get that. I've already made positive points, right? I started by stressing the broad, diverse allies we have if we forge together to continue fighting for our rights. One group that I haven't yet mentioned is the one I'm going to give the last quote to, and that's the many judges who have upheld the Constitution and struck down many post-9/11 government abuses. So for a closing quote, I've selected one such rights protective ruling from a judge for the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. It's based in Atlanta, but its jurisdiction includes Florida. So that's why I chose this quote. And he said, We cannot simply suspend or restrict civil liberties until the war on terror is over, because the war on terror is unlikely ever to be truly over. September 11th, 2001, already a day of immeasurable tragedy, cannot be the day liberty perished in this country.
Hi, my name's Chad.
Hi, Chad.
I have two questions for you. You said that Obama has authorized the killing of Americans. Are you talking about the Predator drone strikes in foreign nations, or are you referring to something else?
Okay, can you tell me your second question?
My second question is then, as with Guantanamo Bay, as a lawyer and a law professor, do you propose or do you agree with having trials for the detainees here in America and placing them in federal prisons?
Yeah. Two excellent questions. Thank you so much, Jed. So the first question has to do with the so-called targeted killing program. And yes, the Obama administration has killed American citizens. The most prominent is somebody named Anwar al-Awlaki. Outside of the United States, to be sure, but not on a battlefield. So these killings have occurred in Yemen and Iraq. And most troublingly, the rationale that the administration gives, namely that this is somebody that we have deemed to be a terrorist threat, that rationale could apply in this country. And that is one of the dangers of this war metaphor. That is the war on terror. It's not a war against a particular country. So logically, by the logic of that war against terror and terrorists, suspected terrorists, the same logic would justify a killing of somebody in the United States without any due process. The second question had to do with Guantanamo. I very strongly support trials in the federal court system. If there is a conviction, which there has been in hundreds of post-9/11 trials of suspected terrorists in the United States court system, then they should be imprisoned in one of the many extremely secure so-called maximum security prison systems. The irony is we have had many convictions of terrorists in the federal court system. We've had none through the military commission system. We haven't even brought to trial. Think about this, 11 years after the terrorist attacks, many years after we have captured those who are bragging about being the masterminds of the 9/11 attacks, not a single one has been brought to trial, has been brought to justice. That, to me, is as much of a national shame and tragedy as the torture and other abuses.
I have a question for you. Under the Patriot Act, one of the things that has been allowed is the detention and search of vehicles with no probable cause. Can you explain to the students how that might have an effect on them directly and whether that's been implemented or challenged?
Yes, Pierre, if we may be on a first-name basis, call me Nadine, two French names there. The Patriot Act, among many others, I use that as just one example, but it was like kind of the tip of the iceberg, so that we now have a whole host of government power to engage in what the technical legal term is a search and seizure of you, your vehicle, your possessions, your papers, your communications, without the essential requirements that the Fourth Amendment lays out. When you read the Fourth Amendment, it says two things. That, first of all, that the government may not engage in a search or seizure, that is, interfere with your freedom or your privacy, unless it has probable cause. That means a specific reason to believe that you, as an individual, has done something illegal or are about to do something illegal. The second requirement is that there be a warrant issued by a neutral magistrate. That means that it's not just the executive branch, the FBI or the local police official on their own say-so
determining that you are a suspect, but there has to be a check and balance. Somebody in the judicial branch second-guessing that determination. So very important substantive requirement of probable cause, individualized suspicion, and a very important check and balance procedural requirement that we're going to have a second look at this from somebody who's independent, not in law enforcement. Both of those have gone by the wayside in the Patriot Act and too many other post-9/11 measures. So the government has sweeping authority to say, if it on its own say-so, without getting a warrant from a judge, believes that the information it gets might be relevant to a terrorism investigation, then they can engage in mass sweeping searches. And obviously, with you young people, I suspect, are more often, this is probably why Pierre asked about it, I suspect that young people are disproportionately pulled over when they are driving because of statistically based stereotypes. I mean, you know, and there's always a statistical basis, right? Young people on the whole have more car accidents, but that doesn't mean that any individual young person is doing something illegal and not driving properly. But unfortunately, the stereotype and the statistics can allow too ready interference, and then you can be subject to a search of what you're carrying in the car and other passengers in the car, and this can lead to very negative consequences.
I would like to ask you, since we are able to imprison more people than any other industrialized country, so we're very good at executing our laws. I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate why it is that if we have constitutional laws, which are precedents, and within law, precedents are very important, why it is that a newly created law by Congress that on the face may not be constitutional is immediately enforceable, even though there's a precedent of constitutional law that is much older and much more founded. Why do we not, I guess, execute the constitutionality laws?
Yeah.
And so things like civil rights, which are obvious in the past as well as maybe even the present, are not executed, whereas these particular laws, more youthful laws, are.
Yeah. Oh, two great questions, John, if you will. I'm going to break it into two because you mentioned the over-incarceration in this country, and I really want to highlight that for a minute before I go on to your question, because this is something else that is of such urgent concern to the young people in this country in particular. The United States has by far the largest prison population, no matter how you measure it, in absolute terms, in proportional terms, proportion to our population, proportionate to our crime rate, and it is absolutely bankrupting state and local governments, including right here in Florida, where so much money is being poured into the prison system and taken out of the school systems. And what is really, you know, there's always a silver lining to the cloud. You can't be an activist without being an optimist. And as a result of what many people are now calling our addiction to incarceration, there are exciting new coalitions of law enforcement officials, prison officials, citizens across the political spectrum saying, let's reform. We need to radically reform our criminal justice system because this over-incarceration is not making us any safer. It's a result of overly strict laws that will have long mandatory minimum prison terms for non-violent drug offenders, people who have possession of a small amount of marijuana, for example. So they're very positive reform efforts that are taking place at the grassroots level, all bipartisan, including here in Florida. So in some ways, that's one answer to your question, John, which is that we don't have to depend on courts to implement the supreme law, the Constitution, which is supreme over all other laws, state and federal laws. But the Constitution is not self-executing, to go back to a point that I said at the beginning, nor are civil rights laws self-executing, nor are Supreme Court precedents self-executing. You have to go to a court to get it to take an action. Let me just make one other point, and then I'd love a follow-up question. which is you can sometimes go to court to get what's called a preliminary injunction. You may know this, other members of the audience might not, to say this law is unconstitutional on its face and therefore it should not go into effect. And we have been able to do that with many laws. For example, when the internet was first invented, the first thing Congress did was what? Try to censor the internet, right? They said it's going to be dangerous for kids. We want to protect kids from the internet. The ACLU was able to go to court and stop that law from ever going into effect, thank goodness. Did you have a follow-up?
I agree that you're using the word self-executing in a very legal term, but no law technically is self-executing.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at Katrina or different areas, we suspend all laws in certain events. And so the fact is that certain precedents or laws that we have, if you make a secondary law in Congress that is on its face unconstitutional, why is it that we are extremely well adept at enforcing these laws and not our constitutional laws?
It's an excellent question, and in fairness, after the Patriot Act was passed, there were certain local law enforcement officials who just refused to enforce parts of it. I remember a very courageous, happened to be African American, this is not a coincidence, a deputy police chief in Portland, Oregon. His chief was out of town, and so he became the acting police chief, and he said, you know, I have been subject to so much racial profiling as an African American, the whole driving while black phenomenon. I'm not going to enforce the portions of these laws that would force me to engage in profiling on the basis of, you know, are you from South Asia or are you an immigrant? So that's a possibility.
I don't know whether this is a question or a statement.
Statements are fine.
Okay.
But then I get to respond.
Sometimes I ask myself if the promise of security is worth more than losing my constitutional amendment rights. And in the certain time that we are now, I just feel that the Patriot Act is not needed. And that will we ever as a nation be able to see it be repealed?
That's a great question / comment, however you characterize it, Travis. And it gives me an opportunity to say this. Look, no constitutional right is absolute, right? However, and let me see, because I'm not like Patrick Henry, who famously said, give me liberty or give me death. I cherish my life, right? I can't exercise my liberty unless I am alive. So safety, and believe me, I've been very active in international human rights. To me, I've been in military dictatorships, I've been in totalitarian dictatorships. Of all of my frightening experiences, the most frightening was when I was in a country that was in a state of anarchy and chaos. And I saw that that is as completely destructive of civil liberties as a too-ordered dictatorship at the other end of the spectrum. So security and liberty are definitely two sides of the same coin. So the Constitution, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, says something very common sense, which is constitutional rights may be restricted by the government if, but only if, the restriction is necessary in order to promote a goal of countervailing goal of compelling importance, of which national security and personal safety often are of course of compelling importance. The problem is, though, that the government simply says that this measure is necessary for our security or safety, but it never actually engages in the analysis. So the whole Patriot Act, they rushed that through, purporting to protect us against future terrorist attacks when they hadn't even analyzed what were the particular failures that caused the disaster on 9/11 itself. The post-9/11 Bipartisan Citizens Commission that a couple of years later did study the causes of the terrorist attacks, said, they came out with dozens of specific recommendations. Not a single recommendation had anything to do with increasing the government's power to engage in surveillance over us. So it was just, this disconnect. To label it as something that is promoting our security doesn't mean that it's actually doing so. And then Travis adds another point, which is even if it had been necessary immediately in the immediate aftermath, doesn't at all mean that it's necessary now. And you may recall, or you may have read, that a number of the controversial Patriot Act provisions had so-called sunset clauses. They were supposed to go out of existence after a certain amount of time, but they've just been automatically reaffirmed and reaffirmed. And Congressman Frey can probably confirm this, that once something is there on the statute books, it's very hard to get Congress to repeal it, which is there's kind of an inertia that builds in, which is why there is all the more reason for us to be very cautious before we allow it to go into effect in the first place.
We talked a lot about hyperpartisanship and how Florida has been the center of attention between both political candidates lately because of our fact that we're not decided really yet. How would you, because there are third-party candidates who take the Constitution more seriously. I haven't heard any candidate that are of the major parties talk about our constitutional rights as seriously as you do. How would you get the American people to take our rights more seriously when it comes to the Constitution, and make the major party candidates listen to us and agree with how we don't like the abridgment of our rights taken advantage of?
Yeah, I really wish I had the answer to that, Frank, and thank you so much for raising it. People are, I completely understand why at the forefront of concerns has to be the economic situation, right? Just as you can't enjoy your liberty if your life is in jeopardy because of serious national security or personal safety threats, I think it would be hard to enjoy your liberty if you cannot make a living and do not have the wherewithal even to survive comfortably, let alone to advocate and exercise free speech, religious freedom, and other rights. So I completely understand people saying pocketbook issues and economic issues are at the forefront. And therefore, this gets to your point, that is why so much of our advocacy is focusing on economic issues, the economic implications of these violations of civil liberties, in addition to the intangible costs on liberty. There are enormous, trillions of dollars that are going into these ineffective and counterproductive programs. Everything from those who criticize the hugely expensive wars as not having improved our national security, the hugely expensive over-incarceration, these mass surveillance programs, and this gets back to the question Pierre asked about former Fourth Amendment rights. The reason why the framers wisely said you need probable cause and a warrant is not only because we want to protect individual liberty, we don't want people to be scapegoated based on the fact that they're young people or they're dark-skinned or they're immigrants. We also don't want our law enforcement resources, our tax dollars, to be wasted by being scattered around surveillance of all of us in this society. That's hugely costly and expensive. The war on drugs has been cataclysmically a waste of money and has helped to fund terrorist groups all over the world, including Al-Qaeda, because they can exploit the black market inflation of drug prices. So I think that we have to speak to people, Frank, in terms of what their immediate concerns are, including dollars and cents issues, but we can make a very compelling case on issue after issue that these violations of civil liberties are costing our precious fortune as well as our precious freedoms.
My question to you is, and you've touched on this in several of your responses, but the purpose of any intelligence agency, be it the CIA, FBI, NSA, is to gather intelligence and protect our great nation, right? So if the government already has most of my information, my social security number, which ties into all of my funds, my banks, everything, why is that bad? If I, as a loyal American, have nothing to hide from them, why is it bad if they know everything about me? Why is it bad if they listen to my conversations?
Duncan, that is such a great question. I always welcome the opportunity to answer because I'm sure a lot of people have exactly that same question. So let me put it from my perspective. I've never committed a crime. I don't think I have anything to hide in terms of confrontations with the law, but I'll tell you my communications that I'm very sorry that the government now has access to. I don't want it to see my love letters to my husband. I don't want it to see my emails to a dying elderly relative with whom I'm sharing memories about from the deathbed of my father. I don't want it to see emails that I'm writing to friends of mine about their marital difficulties or in some cases their dating difficulties. I don't want it to see communications to an in-the-closet gay relative to see what his sexual orientation is. I quite frankly don't want the government to see the books that I'm buying on Amazon.com. I'm happy to share my reading list with my in-person friends. I don't even use friends on Facebook because I try to preserve some privacy to the extent that I can, because that reflects intimate details about who I am in the most fundamental personal sense. My ideas, I'm a very public person, so I'm happy to share those. But I'm not happy to share with you what my tastes are in literature, music, friends, what my religious or lack of religious convictions might be. That's not a matter of public record, what my personal relations are. So if you cherish having a sphere of your life that you share selectively with those with whom you are intimate, as friends, family, relatives, if you cherish that, then you should be concerned. If you don't, then welcome to this new world where Big Brother is watching. Thank you very much.